great to be here. So I think it's part of a two-part sort of sessions of kind of thinking through issues of heritage. So today I was going to sketch kind of where we are at the broad field and try to sort of to come to some reflection on kind of where we are in the field, what our thoughts are on heritage learners. And I think next week is more of a sort of panel with where you will be presenting. And so I'm looking forward to being here again next week. My own interest in heritage learning go way back. I did my dissertation a long time ago on Moroccan immigrants in the Netherlands. I was sort of this 1.5 generation at the time of what was then called guest workers. You had a lot of Turkish and Moroccan guest workers in Northern European countries. And there were a lot of issues with how they were able to not really integrate well into the school system. And a lot of that was due to language issues, not because they were not speaking the language, but there were just a lot of ways in which there were systematic ways of sort of keeping them out of a really complex educational system. And I'm a sociolinguist, so I looked at it from a sociolinguistic perspective. So it started kind of really early on. And then I was sort of in California at the time when a lot of the work started happening there. And I'll go into that in a moment. What's the work that was done at UCLA and places like that. So I was kind of in the right place at the right time, and it's really spurred my interest in all of this to continue working on all of this over the years. So for today, kind of the way I was going to frame it was first kind of look pretty broadly at where the field is and where the field has come in the last few decades. And then look at some definitions of what is considered heritage language, heritage learners. There's always confusion about that, and different people seem to have different understandings. It's a broad category, and then the role of identity has come forward. And you don't have to. I'm happy to share my slides, by the way. I can just send a PDF to Chris, and he can send it on. So
sure, no problem.
Thirdly, I want to look at current pedagogy with what are some thoughts on the differences between a heritage versus an L2 pedagogy. I sent a couple of articles. I think they might not have made it in time, but I will, if not, it's okay. I have a few things here that I will pick out of those articles on differences between heritage learners and L2 learners, and also Carrera's article on differentiated instruction and formative assessment. And then finally, kind of look at some of the challenges, particularly some of the ones that we might see in the types of research institutions that we're working in that I think are different from some other types of institutions. So let's start with the field in the US, and again, there are very different contexts in different countries, Canada, Australia, Europe. So I'm just focusing on the US only because otherwise it becomes more complicated. So Guadalupe Valdez, who's still at Stanford, started very early on, looking really particularly at Spanish as a heritage language, and she's continued to publish over many, many years. And then that was in the 70s. In the 90s, the Center for Applied Linguistics and the National Foreign Language Center in Washington both started a heritage language initiative. People like Joy Payton and people at the Center for Applied Linguistics started that. In 1999, there was this sort of seminal conference Maria Carrera held it at CSU Long Beach. And they brought together everyone that was interested, a lot of people from UC. I was at Berkeley at the time, so I was able to be there. And it was sort of a place where people came together to kind of begin thinking about what this field would look like. And a book came out of that, which was Heritage Languages in America, with a really nice chapter by Fishman, for example, but just laying some of the foundations for what heritage language would be like in the US. Then the journal got created not that long afterwards at UCLA, and then they got this NFLRC grant for a National Heritage Language Resource Center, which is still continuing at UCLA. They have a lot of activities on an annual basis, workshops, and so on, and they are still supporting the journal. And then most recently, in the report by the Commission on Language Learning for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, they also pointed out sort of the necessity of paying attention to heritage languages as part of how we understand language learning in the US. So that's kind of how things have developed. So it continues to be an area that I think is really important. These statistics come from the Kagan article. So basically what this tells us, not only that a significant number of people speak the language other than English at home, but importantly we're seeing a lot of youth coming through the school system that have these language backgrounds, and they will be ending up in post-secondary education. In other words, many of them might end up in your classrooms at some point. And that's 12 million, so we're talking a fairly large sort of demographic wave that's still coming through. So that's in the Kagan article, is what they talk about is that there are a couple of demographic issues. One is globalization, the migration across the globe that we're seeing happening, as well as immigration in the United States, are really leading to a large number of learners that have multiple languages that are coming through the school system, and they say it will be heritage language teaching and learning will remain highly relevant to our national interests. In other words, we really should capitalize on what they bring already, rather than sort of annihilate the languages that they have. This is the recommendation from the Commission on Languages. So they have a number of recommendations, but the third one is really about supporting heritage languages, and they really want heritage language speakers to continue pursuing that. But very often, the research kind of shows, so heritage languages often learned sort of early on in life, and then during the teenage years, it gets rejected. They do not want to be affiliated with anything that their parents speak. And then when they come to college, often there's sort of a reconnect. Like, oh, I really need to come back. And so there's an opportunity, I think, to reach out to this large group of speakers that have a real need to kind of expand both their linguistic, but also their cultural experiences. And they specifically also talk about creating college curricula designed for heritage speakers. Now, how that works depends on a number of factors, and we'll look at that in a little bit. So when we talk about research, there are a number of trends in second language acquisition that I think are really relevant for heritage language acquisition. So we have SLA and HLA, and they're sort of merging, I think. So three that I'll very briefly touch on is the social turn, globalization, which you already saw in the Carrera article, and then what's being termed the multilingual turn, plurilingual turn in applied linguistics. So the social turn goes back about 20 years to a book by Block, who called it the social turn in second language acquisition. And it was a move away from purely cognitive perspectives on second language acquisition to including the broader social, cultural, political aspects. So in other words, language is not just something that develops in the brain, input, output, and there you go, but it's formed by the complex broad interaction, broad culture, and how learners are situated within those cultures and histories. So it's not simply in the brain, it's all around. Everything is, and so the quote by Ota really says that, so it's not just the influence of culture, but it's really human cognition is formed and transformed in this interactive world, the social world. So it's absolutely essential. And so it's changed the whole perspective, and so then you got these theoretical movements like sociocultural theory that are started to look at language acquisition in a very different way than sort of cognitive linguistics and psycholinguistics did before. And then globalization is another factor. I always like this quote by Claire Kamsch, who basically says that globalization has she calls it destabilize, this is my emphasis here, destabilize the codes, norms, and conventions that we used to rely on. So in other words, everything has changed really in the world, and therefore what we do in our language classroom also requires a different way of preparing the learners for a globalized world. The whole notion of the nation state is guides to the one language, one nation, the idea that there are boundaries to languages. All of that has really been erased over the last several decades. And then the second quote is really by, it's a Belgian sociolinguist, Jan Blommaert, that talks about the social linguistics of mobility, but he also talks about the patterns of language. And so we used to think primarily in what he termed territorialized patterns of language, so it's ones that are associated with a nation or a region or a culture, but now they become very much deterritorialized. And so the effects out of that become very unexpected. And so in classroom, we'll see things that are very different than maybe what we might have seen 20, 30 years ago. And I think all of these things are super relevant also for the heritage learners. So this so-called super diversity, so in other words, these people have been moving around the world, interacting with each other, and languages are sort of intermingled. Blommaert, in one of his articles, talks about kind of he has an image of a shop window in Antwerp, and it's a Chinese-owned shop, but in the window there's a sign that's in Dutch and English, and so he talks about sort of this, why, who is he trying to reach here, what's happening? And English, because it is sort of this language of, in Europe, it becomes sort of the lingua franca. Dutch, because it's in Antwerp, and the part of Belgium where Dutch is spoken, and yet it's a Chinese shop, and then the owners will still. So there's this intermingling of languages even in one sentence. And that's kind of part of this, what we see happening right now. And so these languages have become much more fluid. The boundaries are much more fluid than they were before. And we see the same thing with heritage. We see this sort of transnational, very hybrid culture developing. Our heritage learners often, and again, we're getting away from sort of this binary. We often think of it as, in terms of, in this country at least, of an immigrant family, maybe that just moved to a community where that language has been spoken, but at the same time, we may see very different kind of learners that may have already moved with their family to other places and then come, and so they have this, or they've gone to an international school where English was spoken or another language. So you see this very complex, very hybrid kind of culture. So it's really the sort of dichotomous nature of the classroom of, actually the language that's spoken in the community is English, and in this classroom the target language is X. We now have, our expectations are going to be different because our students are going to be very different. We no longer have everyone in the classroom having English maybe as a shared language. We have students from around the world, so we have Yale and quite sure at Columbia as well. They come from all around the world, and their experiences, their repertoires are quite complex. They're not as simple as just having two languages present. And then the last sort of development, more recent, sort of the last 10 years or so in second language acquisition theory is really the multilingual term. And again, the idea here is because we're dealing with these super diverse contexts of language, language use, we also need to kind of change the perspective in the research. In particular, this was initially kind of for the research, but there's an application, of course, in the classroom, from a monolingual perspective to a multilingual perspective. And it's just a new norm, so we don't make these assumptions of just monolingualism. In a very recent article, and I cite Claire Compton because I really like her work, and I recommend her work to you if you would like to read an interesting articles. It's always her. She talks, it's an afterword of a special journal issue. She talks about the implications of the multilingual term for language pedagogy, and it's being misconstrued by a lot of people. The term translanguaging, which I won't go in here, as well as the multilingual term, very often has been sort of interpreted as anything goes, whatever, just talk, have multiple languages in the classroom and everyone is good. And of course that would be really problematic in a language classroom where we're having a target language to work on. It's just not sort of code switching, whatever way you want, and everything's fine. But what she said is there's a shift in mindset from a monolingual one to a multilingual one. In other words, our assumptions about what learners bring to the classroom should really be broadened, because if we make the assumption based on the notion that they're all kind of Americans, speakers of English, and so on, then we're missing out on a whole bunch of perspectives that can really add to what goes on in the classroom. And that's really what we're talking about. So it's really having them bring those perspectives, these understandings, these different histories, these different experiences, into their learning, because they'll relate to their learning in very different ways based on their own repertoires. Of course, what is going to happen is it's going to lead to what she calls your ambiguities of meaning, pedagogic uncertainties. It's not nearly as clean as just sort of the monolingual perspective. And learning outcomes are going to be different because the experiences are going to be different. This is particularly also the case with heritage learners who have very different life experiences. And the other thing that we have talked about a lot these days, or is being talked about, I just came back from AAAL, and a lot of people talk about the notion of symbolic power struggles between languages. So, especially again with heritage learners, the awareness of the inequities that there are among the perceptions of different languages. Often heritage languages are very marginalized. Learners feel very disempowered because their communities are very disempowered. And so bringing that into the classroom kind of creates these moments of talking about legitimacy of their varieties, whatever those varieties may be, and social justice, understanding their position sort of in the broader framework of the languages that we bring into the classroom. So that's something the current research is really looking at, particularly also for heritage learners. How can we create this critical awareness of these multiple varieties and help students be empowered through their own language awareness and not be ashamed, because a lot of heritage learners have shame about they've been often told that they're not good enough, either by their teachers in the classrooms in the United States, or by their relatives when they go back home, because they may look like someone that comes from that culture, but they don't sound like someone that comes from that culture. Oh, well, you don't speak the language well enough. You're really not fill in the blank, Chinese or Korean or whatever. So they have lived with that shame, and so that's something that we can do in a heritage classroom, is trying to work on that aspect. So those are some of the things that are the case for SLA, and Lehman basically has said that these were considered distinct fields when they started out, because when heritage language acquisitions first started, it was sort of seen as, okay, this is very new, it's a different process, because second language acquisition usually happens after the first language has been formed, and then there are variable outcomes. Whereas heritage language is a disrupted process, so the heritage language comes first, and at some point it gets disrupted, and there's a shift to another language. So in this context, in this country, it's often the heritage language, and then a shift to English, and then a dominance of English, and a sort of a waning of the heritage language. But more recently, the perspectives in SLA have really influenced also similar research in HLA, so it's really coming together. And one of the things that Lynch talks about, and I think it fits in really well with our current perspectives in SLA, is we really need to start looking at the whole process, the acquisition, the use, the repertoires of speakers throughout their lives, to get a better picture. So the original work in HLA was often done on the basis of simply pedagogy, often done in the classroom, but it didn't really have the depth that SLA research has had, and so that's been called for, and I think that's where the research has been heading in recent years. All right, so moving on to a few definitions, which I had been asked to give. So there's a whole bunch of different definitions that have been used over the years. In that first book, Fishman called a heritage language a language of personal relevance other than English, which I still very much like. It's not a precise definition, it's a very broad definition, but I think it's a very, it's a definition that I think captures sort of the affective part of what a heritage language is. The Valdez definition really is the one that's, I think, most frequently used, so that assumes a level of proficiency. So they're raised in homes where another language is spoken. They can speak or understand to some extent the language, and they're to some degree bilingual. So it assumes proficiency as part of that definition. In the article that I wrote, that I sent you, I've argued against that. I've said that there are a lot of heritage learners that have a very strong motivation or have a strong connection to the culture, but they may not have any of the language. And so that would be another category that we need to look at. And it has implications for the classroom because they're beginning learners of the language, but they may bring a wealth of other cultural understandings. So they're different from L2 learners, but their proficiency is equivalent to beginning L2 learners. So what do we do? So that they're complicated. So after that, Polinsky and Kagan basically said, okay, there are two kinds of definitions. One is broad, which essentially includes one that where there is no functional proficiency. It can be just anyone with some connection, or a narrow definition where the core of it is some level of proficiency, so that there is some level of acquisition. And then in their survey, they kind of outline kind of more of a profile. So someone that first acquired HL and then acquired English, again, US context. Limited exposure outside the home, so it's really the home language, which we often see. So it's the registers are often very limited to more informal domains. Strong oral skills, limited literacy skills. I don't really agree with positive HL attitudes and experiences. I think a lot of heritage learners have very negative attitudes and experiences. But in their study, this came out more positive. And then they studied the heritage language to connect with other speakers, whether it's their family, their communities, and to really kind of understand their own identities. So these are some, so again, we think of who our learners are, and it might very much vary according to who you have, or sometimes from language to language. Another piece of this really is the central role of identity as part of a definition of learners. And Hornberger and Wang were kind of had an early article about that talked about they have some kind of ancestral tie, and then, but importantly, they exert their agency in determining whether or not they're heritage language learners of that language world. On the web, so that's good. And this is an interesting, so they exert agency with respect to that, and I'm glad my daughter isn't here because I'm going to give her as an example. So my daughter is adopted from India, southern India, and when she was little I spoke only Dutch to her for the first 6 years, and then she kind of switched to English, but she still understands Dutch very well. And so when she went to college, she had to put down her ethnic affiliation, and she put Dutch American, asserting her identity. I mean, to her, that was the core of her identity, the language that she grew up with. She identifies with Dutch culture. So so they really say that identity is much chosen as it is assigned. So seeing her, one would assign, oh well, you're Indian, you're from India. And she would reject that completely because, no, I'm Dutch. How can you not see I'm Dutch? I'm so clearly Dutch. So it's a chosen identity, and part of it is the language. It's just a language ability which she does not have in the language of her ancestry. And Agnes Ho, who writes a lot about this as well, talks about is that it's really the centerpiece of HL development. And that has really serious implications for the classroom, because it's very different from what you do in an L2 classroom. So, question for you, because a lot of these things vary very much from one language to another, from one culture to another. What are some challenges that you encounter with the language that you teach in terms of your learners? And what are their goals? And what are some issues, linguistic or socioaffective? How do they identify themselves? What are their reasons for wanting to study the languages that you teach? Sure, diversity here.
Oh, come on, jump in.
We're supposed to have homework.
It's definitely a variety. I mean, I've had kind of the case of low proficiency heritage learners who mostly want to be able to talk to grandma and that kind of thing. And I've also had higher proficiency, learners who want to have professional proficiency. So it's a pretty broad range.
I would say personal and academic, because I teach Hindi and he teaches Urdu. He doesn't have any professional, very direct professional implications.
Mostly they are they want to talk to their families, and they want to connect with their families, relatives in India and Pakistan.
Yeah, and it gives them a sense of pride when they can actually talk, because often there's that, this disconnect with their own families, which is really painful.
In Portuguese, we don't have as many as the Spanish of the Latin American and Iberian cultural department where the Spanish have on and Portuguese. In Portuguese, we don't have as many native speakers as they have in Spanish. But the case is that these students that grew up in the U.S. and somehow heard Portuguese at home and they want to connect with
Yeah, I like your definition that they don't necessarily need to know the language. And now when I think about my student in first year, Serbian, she grew up, both parents are from Serbia, they're here in America since the 90s, she was born, and she now decided to learn the language. But she's way, way ahead of the others because of the obvious reason that this language was probably spoken at home, and she was a passive kind of recipient.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I'm from Spanish, going here, city class, and with Spanish they have wider knowledge that I guess with other languages, so we have different levels of so basic and intermediate. But what I really wanted to highlight is when you said that it's very important to know the context of the students and the stories of the students and the history of the students, because I'm comparing the students we have here at Columbia, that most of them are very positive about their heritage profile. But I was in Miami before with Andrew Lynch that you were quoting, and there's a lot of resistance about self-identity in Miami, right? That 99% of people there are heritage speakers, right?
Yeah.
And the same Miamian people are very resistant about entering these courses. And I think it has also a lot to do with some socioeconomic factors, etc., right? So I think it's very important to know these other factors that may affect their affective dimension as well.
I'm not teaching, but I'm facilitating one of the classes in the Shared Course Initiative, Yoruba, and it's almost all heritage learners, but really on a very rich spectrum in terms of some have a lot of speaking knowledge. Some can speak and understand, but they don't know the tonal system. Others do, and others are learning it because maybe there's one student who was adopted and she's trying to uncover her family history and learning the language. So there's also the kind of broad heritage learning as well.
Yeah, so a wide range, and it depends on so many different contexts. I mean, how big the language is also, like Dutch, I talk Dutch, and there is really no community where Dutch is spoken, for example, so it's really difficult for heritage speakers to actually have that opportunity, where for other, like Spanish in Miami, everyone, at least they have an opportunity to speak it, or to, to have shops and maybe religious activity, all kinds of reasons where they are kind of supported in their development in some way. So let's move on to pedagogy a little bit. I am going to take a few slides from the article by Curra and Chick that talks about the differentiated teaching, and they focus on these two areas. So they say really it's both linguistic, but it's also really important that we think about the socio-affective. And with respect to their abilities, so they don't come to us because they've taken coursework, X number of classes, and now they're here. But it's their life experiences that are very, very different. And so they're incredibly variable, and it's difficult, even if you have a heritage track, to put them all in a group. They deal with this notion of identity, seeking who they are, seeking their culture, and often they feel rejected, as I was saying earlier, by both cultures. They're neither fish nor fowl. They fit in between, and they often see that as problematic, navigating that. Although, we should really attempt to turn it around and make that, positive, because if we think about the MLA report, that's translingual and transcultural competence. They have that third position where they are able to reflect on both languages. So they, and this is from the article, but I just wanted to point a couple of things out. So one is their comparison of their ability. So this is with respect to language. So when we look at heritage learners, they could do a lot with the language, where L2 learners really know more about it because they can articulate rules, for example. They know about grammar. Heritage learners also can do a lot of spontaneous tasks with respect to spontaneous situations, where L2 learners are much more capable of control, classroom-based types of tasks, because that's what they've been trained to do. Usually they can speak and understand really well, not read and write it so well. In most languages, the reading and writing part is lagging behind their speaking and understanding. And when authentic materials are used, they tend to focus more on content, where L2 learners focus more on form. So that balance, so then how can you counterbalance that? So that would be then one issue in the classroom. So with respect to their affective needs, as I just noticed, they straddle these two worlds, they struggle with that. And so that's something that one can work on in the classroom. I have a couple of examples of activities. They look at their family connections, and they try to seek an identity sometimes. Sometimes they don't have it, but they're seeking it in that culture. Whereas L2 learners don't have that. I mean, they come, again, with my Dutch learners as an example, I would have students who didn't speak a word of English, their parents only spoke English with them. But when it came to cultural things, they knew everything, all the way that holidays were done, and food, and all the traditions, they knew all of that. They just didn't know a word of Dutch. But they were very culturally Dutch, but they were linguistically completely zero. And they brought that to the classroom, where the L2 learners were kind of on that side of the spectrum. So Maria Carrera has talked a lot about differentiated instruction as one way of addressing the needs of heritage learners, whether it is in a separate track or whether it is in a mixed classroom. And it really starts sort of with providing each learner with an individualized kind of learning plan, in essence. And there are ways of doing that. Of course, it's a lot of work, and it's complicated. But it's not assuming that the SLOs, the student learning outcomes that you have on your syllabus are going to be the same for everyone. The outcomes may be different, and those are going to be built into the curriculum. So that's the essence of differentiated instruction, which also can be used, of course, in an L2 classroom. It's not just for heritage learning. It can be used for other purposes as well. So there are different things you can modify. If you're creating a heritage program or incorporating heritage learners in your program, clearly the materials have to be different. The activities need to be different. There's more of a focus on the process rather than on the product in a heritage classroom, more like how they go through the process as opposed to necessarily what they come out with. And then the pacing can be different too. It can be sped up in some cases, or slow down, so that pacing is be different. And so a lot of it depends on the student's interest and where they come in. I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is in the article. But they provide some ideas, some tools that they've used to make that work in a classroom. So they have 8, like for example, grouping them in a dynamic way. So in other words, because a lot of people have these notions about, there's some recent research by Melissa Bowles that they're sort of debunking, saying, oh, well, you should pair up a heritage and a non-heritage learner. And that doesn't always work. Or you should pair up someone with greater proficiency with someone with lesser proficiency. That's kind of a static way of doing. So they're saying you really need to make it much more dynamic, depending on what you're doing. Kind of really think about how you pair and group people, and switch that up depending on the activity, depending on what it is that you're trying to do. And then they have some what they call learning agendas and anchor activities, which are, you give the students a set of activities that they have X amount of time to do. So it's almost like, and along with that is a learning contract. So you essentially say, your grade is going to depend on doing all the things in this contract, and giving them whatever information you want, rubrics, etc. But the students then kind of follow those activities, and then at the end, and that can be different. So different learners can have different ways of going through a course. And then a couple of other of these. I want to point out this one. You probably know the KWL chart, also used in L2 classrooms, is where you work with learners and you ask them, what do we know already? What do we want to learn? And then after, they reflect on what have we learned. And so it's a very, it identifies their needs and their interests. And so you plan that things accordingly. It makes it more messy, but it does give a lot of individual learners an opportunity to kind of explore their own needs. And then something that Maria Carrera talks about a lot is exit cards. She, in her classes, gives students these little cards at the end of every class, and there are different ways of doing it. One of the ones she does is the aha moment. So she asks the students, was there something in this class that made you realize, aha, I didn't know that, now I do. And so they write that down on their card. Or you can just say, what did I learn in today's lesson? Give me 2 things that I learned, whether it's just 2 pieces of vocabulary or a realization about some cultural thing, whatever it is. So there are ways of very quickly getting a sense of, what have they gotten out of the lesson. You may have your goals for the lesson, but they may get different things out of it. And so it's also helpful for a teacher to have these. And then the same similar is that she does these quick checks for understanding as a whole class, non-verbally, raise your hand, things like that, just to kind of see if they've understood things about the lesson. Yes, no, for example. It's very simple. And then the second thing, so they have all these tools, and then the second thing they really focus on is the process. So more formative assessment rather than summative assessment. So really shifting from outcomes that are sort of like, okay, here's a product, to more like as an ongoing assessment, kind of looking at what's happening in the class, making sure the students are understanding, allowing students to self-monitor, to self-assess. And so for them, this process works better with heritage learners. Doesn't mean that you don't have tests, it doesn't mean it just means that the relative emphasis of formative assessment is greater with heritage learners than with L2 learners in general, by their recommendation. I've got two examples of affective activities here. One was developed, some of you may know about this, by Sybil Alexandrov and Angela Lee Smith. Sybil's in Spanish and Angela's in Korean at Yale. And they've kind of exported this project to other institutions. So what they've done is they've created this process of reflection among heritage learners. I think they have now 8 languages. We have a heritage language interest group, so a lot of ideas are shared. And so we now have 8 languages that are participating in this project. So the first thing is a questionnaire, a survey that they fill out where they reflect on their identity. Then they write a text about that. And then they get an opportunity to meet with another heritage learner from another language. And they compare and discuss their experiences as a heritage learner. And a lot comes out in these conversations of shared experiences, even though they have come from very different cultural backgrounds. And then finally, they reflect on it together, on this whole experience. And so there are all these really interesting conversations that take place. Of course, during COVID, it had to be via Zoom, but ideally, it's kind of in person where they actually meet up. And so, you know, a Korean learner might meet up with, you know, someone from Chinese or Spanish. And so there are all these different ways that they get to know their experiences as a learner better. And then another activity that Angela has developed, and she has a whole bunch, if you go to this website, there's a whole bunch of examples of all kinds of activities. But I like this one in terms of, you know, when we think about the socio-affective activities. She has them reflect on their language, their name, because often Korean learners have names that are difficult in the context of you know, English speakers might not be able to pronounce them, so they often adopt an English name just to make it easier. I think Chinese learners do that as well. And so she has to go back to the meaning of their names and really look at their history. They often write an oral history project about this as well, but they also discover the meanings. Why was I named that? Why are names done in a certain way in Korean culture? So they have to go back to their families and ask about that. Are other members of the family named the same way? And so they go through the whole project of kind of developing an understanding of their own names. And I think this is a really nice, you know, in this process of identity, it's a nice project. And I think for many languages this can be interesting. These names are so culturally rich that it's a nice, even, you know, certainly for heritage learners that may have these names that others, if you look at my name, for example, when I tell people my full name, which is even longer than Nelleke van Deusen-Scholl, you know, people don't understand because I also am named Nelleke van Deusen-Scholl. I have 3 other names. And so my first name, my official first name started with a P, even though I go by Nelleke, and Americans don't get it. They're like, what is that? So, you know, having students explore these kind of complexities is a way for them to kind of connect with their identities. All right, so I know, looking at the time, I don't want to get into the end. Some current research perspectives. I already mentioned this earlier, but a lot of current research, particularly Jennifer Neiman's work in sociolinguistics, is looking at thinking about the heritage varieties and their repertoires as legitimate. So thinking of the whole range. So when students come into the classroom, they may be speaking a mixed variety that, you know, we might pejoratively call Spanglish because they mix English and Spanish. But in their community, that's the variety that is used. So the way to think about the heritage classroom is a way where we add other repertoires, other registers, but we don't erase what they bring. And so it's an additive model. So that I think often in the past, it was thought, oh, well, they're deficient, they have gaps in their language. And so we want to kind of rethink that, not so much as they have gaps, no, they already bring interesting repertoire, but they may not have the entire range of repertoire. So that's what we're going to do in the classroom. We don't want to ever, just kind of diminish what they already have. And so part of that is this, what they would call critical translingual competence. So they reflect on this, and we give them agency in understanding that certain varieties and certain repertoires are very valid in certain contexts, and understanding which contexts those are. So a lot of that research fits in very well with kind of the work that's being done in SLA in a multilingual term to really understand the dynamic nature of linguistic repertoires. Coming to challenges, there are many. In Career and Chick, they mentioned, there is so much diversity. Students our L2 learners are also very multilingual. They may come, to learning Spanish, maybe having Chinese as their native language or any other kind of language. And so dealing with this is going to take kind of a rethinking of what we do in the classroom, whether we have heritage tracks separately or we have them mixed in, and again, it might depend a little bit on your situation. They also point out that if you're heritage speakers, we can't always assume that they are speakers of the language that we're teaching. So they may be in a Hindi class, but they may actually be Tamil speakers, for example, or come from other backgrounds. A lot of students in African languages are seeking what's been termed as Pan-African identity. They're relating to a heritage that they perceive, but they may not be a speaker of those languages. We saw that in some research that we did on the Shared Course Initiative, where a lot of learners would come to different languages where, at first you'd say, why are they identifying it as their heritage language? But in fact, their heritage language may be different. But that's, often that's the perception of their identity as broader than necessarily what is associated with that language and culture. And that makes it complicated because we cannot then assume a certain level of proficiency or even cultural understandings that are shared. So those motivations are part of the complexities. Particularly in private institutions, Ivies like ours, I think there are some particular challenges because a lot of the research is based in public institutions, UCLA, for example, where they talk about local communities, the Korean community in Los Angeles, and we don't draw on local communities. Very, very few of our students come from local communities, come from all around the world, and so their experiences are also very, very different. We cannot just make an assumption that they have sort of this shared experience. I think there is kind of a double challenge or a double trauma. So the one I mentioned earlier, being a heritage speaker already brings with it usually, complexities. But then when they're in an Ivy League where they're supposed to be like the best, and things are, you always want to stand out. Sometimes identifying a heritage learner makes you feel like, I'm not measuring up, I'm not good enough. And so sometimes there are these negative feelings of not being adequate. It's almost like a remedial course as opposed to, no, this is a course that fits your needs. And so that's something we have to think about. And then we teach a lot of small languages, less commonly taught languages, where we usually don't have enough room for separate tracks. If we have 5 students in a classroom, we can't put them in 2 different tracks. So we have to mix. And sometimes the heritage learners sort of outnumber the non-heritage learners. Our Vietnamese program at Yale, I think, are 99% heritage, our Yoruba program as well. And so there might be one L2 learner among 15 heritage learners. So that's really also a problem. So quickly, what are your challenges? I know we need to talk about this next week, but I'm just curious, what are some challenges that you face in your programs?
I'll give you a cookie.
So we are just actually starting, we just started this semester a heritage track. We used to have only an intermediate level. This semester we started teaching the elementary. I'm not teaching personally. But I think one of the challenges with the placement that I anticipate, and that you can help me with this, but certain students were like really in the very low non-proficiency level, right? But they still end up going to our L2 classes, but there's still something there, like the identity part, and there's suddenly these things that come out of nowhere. No, like suddenly they feel comfortable, and then something in Spanish kicks, no? But they wouldn't survive in a class for heritage speakers because we will be speaking Spanish like completely, and then we'll be lost, right? So that's what
The placement, yeah, it's a huge one, yeah.
I mean, I'm very intrigued by, the model of differentiated teaching. I think that's, a way you can get around this when you have a combined class. But I wonder, in general, how do you cope with this when you're already teaching 3-3? How do you make differentiated teaching not twice as much work for you as an instructor? And then physically, how do you make it happen when you're in a very small group in an even smaller classroom?
Many challenges.
Yeah, that's true. There's a lot. Yeah, I mean, some of this also may need to take place, so they're talking a lot about beyond the classroom. Because, in the classroom it's really difficult. And Yale, we've started a pilot now with we meet 5 days a week, but 1 day is asynchronous. So that would be an opportunity to say the asynchronous day is going to be, one where you're doing different things. But yeah, it's logistically very, I'm not saying that it's easy, I'm just saying it's one way to begin thinking about it, but it is complicated, absolutely.
I also find it because they are so much concentrated on content and not on formal side, I find it almost impossible to teach them the case system. So that's just like fails over and over again.
You have to put their feet to the fire sometimes.
And then, how much explicit grammar do you need to teach if they're already, their usage is correct, and maybe not, but on the other hand, if it's, if the standard is different, then there has to be attention to that, and you need to separate that out.
I mean, just as a partial response then, and a partial response to my own question is, I mean, I do have these students with very different backgrounds, but there is a lot of convergence, right? These students in intermediate, they are all aiming towards something approaching professional proficiency, even though they're coming at it from different directions, right? And so they all want to have the same kind of ability to write at the end. And at the same time, too, that there are so few of them in my less commonly taught languages, I really want them to feel like they're part of one community, even though they come at it from a different place. We are all the people here who want to speak Czech, and write it well, and at a certain register.
Yeah, and I've been there myself with Dutch. I would have a lot of grad students, and one would actually want to do Afrikaans and working on elephants in Kruger Park, and I had another one that was a historian, so I'd have to kind of get them all, to what they wanted to do. So a lot of the readings were separate that they did, but managing it all and getting them all where they needed to be was really complicated. I know I need to wrap, so I have one more slide, and then it's just very quick wrapped up. Just what I've already said, it's a very diverse group, very complex motivations. Their multilingual backgrounds are complicated, but they also will bring them into the world in a way that they can very dynamically position themselves, because they have that extra depth of linguistic competence that many L2 speakers will not reach. Therefore, the classroom should be flexible. We should bring in that exploration of identity in a way that they can grow. And primarily, I think the process-oriented approach is a way to think about getting away so much from the product per se as the process of moving forward from wherever they are to wherever they want to be. And that's it. I have a bunch of references that I'm happy to share. There's more, but these are some of the ones I've used. And thank you for having me today.
We have time for some questions if you want.
And I can share it.
We can have them formally. We can also have an informal talk. Nelleke, since we have consent.
Can you say a few words about what next week's event is? Okay.
Thank you, Chris. We can also have an informal talk over coffee and cookies. I'll remind you that Nelleke is coming back next week at the same time, same place, and she will engage in a dialogue with members of 3 of our programs, Chinese, Spanish, and Hebrew, who will briefly present why they decided and how they're addressing the needs of heritage speakers in their own programs. And she'll just enter into a dialogue with them. But that doesn't mean that the rest of you should not also participate and talk about your own challenges in dealing with heritage speakers, even though you may not have a quote-unquote formal heritage track at Columbia, because I know a lot of you do have heritage speakers in your courses, despite the fact that sometimes the languages are very small. I was really surprised. Check, Chris. You want to add something or going like this?
Which is?
So, any questions on Nelleke's presentation? Feel free.
I just have one element.
Or comment.
One element that I experienced, that the heritage student now comes in and he learns the language grammatically and speaking properly. Then he goes home, or she goes home, and she uses it, and then they start telling her, no, you're speaking standard, but we're not speaking. So there's still a war going on there, because now she's acquired more, she reads more, and so on. And those people who are at home are, let's say, heritage speakers, and they find that she's advanced, she's doing more in the language, and then so there's hostility developing at home, like, you know more, you think you know more than us.
Well, and that's where this critical language awareness comes in, because this is where we want to think about, you don't want to necessarily learn to speak proper and this is the only right way to speak. I mean, they have to understand this is the right way to speak in a certain context. When I go home, I have another piece of linguistic repertoire.
That part they understand, but it's the enemy that develops, like, you are knowing more than what we are doing.
Right, yeah.
So that develops
They
a whole, like,
manipulate,
you're not
yeah.
an intellectual, you think
Yeah.
so, and we're listening.
It's difficult, but I think, working on sort of making sure that we validate their community. We cannot in the classroom say, language that your grandmother speaks is really, not proper, it's bad. So, making sure that there's a range of...
No, that wasn't the issue.
No, I see what you're saying, and it is a way of saying, okay, it's the same way, I think, with, just having having gotten a college degree, or maybe some part of the family has not gotten a college degree, and it's difficult to position yourself back with, your family in that sense. No, I see your point, it's difficult for me.
So perhaps a couple of comments on my part. We were invited together to talk at the Modern Greek Studies Association, where I did not make myself very popular with my fellow Greeks, because I pointed out to them that one of the problems they're facing and they're refusing to acknowledge is that if they want to grow, they're going to have to grow outside the heritage group. You cannot simply teach Greek to people with Greek last names if this is what you want to, if you want to expand. You're going to have to find a way to make your language relevant to people outside your heritage group. It didn't go down very well. And it didn't go down very well for the other reason that I'll point out. A lot of the people who push that agenda push a very conservative agenda. Learning Greek is respecting church, respecting authorities and so forth, a very old-fashioned kind of approach to values, with which younger learners really don't connect, and yet, you know, we're still stuck into this thing. I don't know if you have any comments on it.
Well, the Korean program, certainly Yale has done it really well, because they've got K-pop, so
Well, we
they
don't
have
have
a huge
K- we don't have
heritage
K-pop.
track, but they have this enormously grown, you know, Korean program that's just expanding, so, but not every culture has K-pop, so.
I don't know if this is the problem that some of you also have had.
I had questions about definitions. By Fishman's definition, am I a heritage speaker of Czech, even though I started learning the language when I was 22 because I married a Czech person and it's obviously very personally important for me?
I would say that by Hornberger's definition, you assign your own identity.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, by the strict definition of you grew up speaking the language, there was a disruptive process, and then you switched to another language, no.
No.
But
wasn't Fishman's thing, it's just a language of personal importance?
relevance,
Yeah.
right, yeah. And, you know, and the level of motivation, you know. So Fishman has sort of three categories. So one is immigrant languages, one is more native languages, and then the group that he calls colonial languages. So Dutch is one of those. So there are a lot of people that have I was in Michigan, Holland, Michigan. There were more Dutch than, you know, my great-great-great-grandparents probably were, because I didn't recognize it as Dutch culture. It was like a Dutch culture of the 18th century or something. But they were all extremely Dutch. They didn't speak Dutch, but they were very, very strongly, you know, connected to Dutch culture and everything. There were tulips and windmills and clogs. And, I mean, anything that I have, you know, well, tulips, yes, but clogs, no. But it was sort of that language very strongly. So as colonial languages have this big distance where usually proficiency is no longer part of it per se as you're growing up. So in your case, as you're growing up, you may not have that proficiency, but then, you know, you acquired it. So.
You sure those weren't Greek Americans? The icon.
So, yeah.
Well, one of like a comment to your question, Stefan, we have a lot of negative heritage in Balkans that attract non-heritage speakers.
Yeah, all the conflict studies people, right?
Well, you know, I mean, you know the two models we have in Greece: land of the glorious ancestors,
True.
or sun and fun. That's
Yeah, okay.
what we're dealing with. Other questions? No? Then, you know, please have some cookies. And I hope we will see you all next week. I mean, I'm really looking forward to next week. I really want to hear from you about the motivations that drove you to create a heritage track, how you decide who goes into that track, and what you expect from your students. Do they join up at some point with other learners of the language, or do you keep them separate? And I'm sure Nelleke will be able to, you know, engage in a fruitful dialogue with you on this.
Interested in hearing.
But it's a very important issue. I think we're going to be seeing it more and more in the years to come. And we really need to think about this and not continue to think that teaching a language, I was going to say a foreign language, is teaching a monolingual language to a monolingual speaker in another language. You know, we really need to get out of that mindset. Especially at an institution like ours, when you look at the rich linguistic profile